Welcome to Futures Hub, the podcast that ignites curiosity and navigates the pathways to tomorrow. I'm Mia, your guide on this journey into the future, where we explore the art of foresight, community co-creation, and personal growth. In each episode, we dive deep into innovative techniques to unlock the potential to shape our individual capacities and contribute to vibrant, inclusive communities. Join us as we mine the rich landscape of foresight, community empowerment, and building bridges between diverse voices. Whether you're a seasoned futurist or just dipping your toes into the world of foresight, let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to Futures Hub. Welcome to Futures Hub, where we explore the intersection of foresight, co-creation, and community building to shape futures for all. Today, I'm joined by the team behind Method Collective, a group of interdisciplinary creatives. Rooted in life-centered design, systems thinking, and strategic foresight, Method Collective works across sectors, from climate to healthcare to the arts. We dive into their groundbreaking project, Space for Grief, an initiative creating physical and emotional spaces for grief to be shared, witnessed, and honored. Together, we explore grief-informed futures, collective memory, and how shifting mindsets can help communities not just survive, but truly thrive. Method Collective consists of three multi-talented individuals, Zian Hussein, Kala Lee, and Fran Quintero Rawlings. Zian is a systems and foresight practitioner with a track record of delivering unique and innovative solutions across private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. He's worked on product and service design internationally and has led projects including the redesign of Toronto City Hall, service management for the Federal Courts of Canada, systems inquiry for Curling Canada, and more. He's worked on multiple hardware and digital products currently in market, including multiple effects pedals with renowned audio technology company Eventide Audio. He's also a composer and guitarist with multiple composition and performance credits with artists such as Plini, Kurt Swinghammer, Sundake, Ashikuzuman Tulu, and Rocket Zombie. He's been involved with and has led art-based initiatives for over 2 decades, from music community organization in Dhaka, Bangladesh, to technology showcases at NAMM in Los Angeles, to curation for the Real Asian Film Festival in Toronto for 5 years. He's an endorsed artist with Strandberg Guitars, which was named Guitar Innovation of the Decade in 2020. Kala is a strategist, designer, and facilitator who uses an intersection of art, experience, and data to understand how people and systems relate, interact, and overlap. Her experience managing and growing organizations provides insight into the many ways people design and engage with systems and processes to work toward future goals and solutions. In all her work, Kala uses her years of graphic design experience to visually communicate complexity through simplicity, such as co-developing visual theories of change with the United Nations Joint Sustainable Development Group and Disaster Risk and Relief Departments, and to create compelling and evocative experiences in community art spaces as co-producer of projects such as Space for Grief. Additionally, Kala has supported over 200 food entrepreneurs across Southern Ontario at Foodpreneur Lab in starting and scaling their food service and manufacturing businesses. Fran is a deeply curious strategist, foresight practitioner, designer, and artist, passionate about guiding individuals and organizations to explore how to shape the future. She helps teams design collaborative, future-ready solutions rooted in equity, care, and systemic change. Fran is the managing director of Method Collective, where she's partnered with a wide range of clients across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. As an artist, she creates speculative, sensory-rich installations that ignite dialogue around grief, equity, and well-being. Fran teaches in Sheridan College's Creativity and Innovation program, where she supports the next generation of changemakers. Outside of work, she finds joy in bouldering, dancing, and discovering new places. Whether you're a designer, policymaker, community builder, or someone simply looking for new ways to think about healing and hope, this conversation is one you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. Thank you all for joining us today on the Futures Hub podcast. We're so grateful to have you here and so excited to hear your insights and have this conversation, knowing so much of the great work you've been doing in this space. I was hoping to start first and foremost at the beginning, the origin story of Method Collective. Wondering if you can share how Method Collective began and what inspired you to form this team of curious creatives.
We like to say that we were bitten by radioactive spiders, but actually it came from noticing our workforces and workplaces and seeing that a lot of them felt very exploitative and misaligned with human needs. And we wanted to create something different. During the pandemic, especially, we saw a lot of societal polarization. We really felt inspired at that time to jump in and bring in something that all of us had, which was a long-time love of really nicely designed services, products, things that really brought personality life, things that were enduring, things that would last, not things with planned obsolescence baked in. And what was beautiful about that coming together was that each of us has very different backgrounds, but we share many common threads in our values, as well as being part of the same master's program about 10 years ago. After working together on a few projects, things really came together, and here we are.
You three come from all different backgrounds, and it's true, it's evident in the work that you do that it spans so many different disciplines. You have foresight, you have design, you have wellness. How do you navigate the complexity of integrating these various perspectives, of bringing all these different backgrounds together?
It requires holding domain knowledge for multiple industries, sectors, their dynamics, processes, even their lingos and terminology used, along with measures of success. It requires aligning that knowledge with frameworks that span fields of design, behavioral psychology, policy, science, as well as art. So we've developed sets of processes and frameworks that build upon established models and systems thinking, design, business policy, and foresight, including, but not limited to, definitely, things like causal layered analysis, Lotus model, along with a host of systems archetypes. And this is constantly being reinforced through our projects.
As a team, we're actually really lucky that we each have such deep experience in all of these different verticals. Myself, I've been a graphic designer for many years with a specialization in translation of information and telling complex stories through infographics. I've also worked across the food service and manufacturing supply chain, anything from branding and retail to systems and strategy for a national incubator. Fran, she's had deep roots in community engagement, as well as with ministries of energy and labor, while Zan has worked as the head of service management for the federal Canadian courts. He's worked on hardware and software product design for nearly 20 years and is also an endorsed artist with several major music equipment manufacturers. We really try to balance that real-world practical experience and that deep theoretical knowledge as well. And as Ayan mentioned, we all have the same masters in design and strategic foresight and innovation. But before that, we did come from diverse backgrounds. Zayan has also pursued degrees in political science, economics, design, as well as certificates in business analysis, biotechnology, sound design. Fran has worked frontline in community running large nonprofits, as well as experience from government as well as healthcare sectors. So really through this combination of these past experiences, skills, interests, and then the years of systemic projects across multiple sectors and industries, such as culture, health, law, construction, cemeteries, climate, and public policy, all of it's really allowed us to constantly reinforce that knowledge and build those connections between people, industries, and sectors.
That's wonderful. I could see with such in-depth knowledge, the need and the value to bridge with clients, and that you're pulling from so many different frameworks that some of your clients may not necessarily be aware of the lingo or the language. So having that wealth of knowledge amongst yourselves and different approaches, I could definitely see how that could be really helpful for clients that are working with you to have access points to these different types of insights. You have so many different entry points to the work you do, but one of the core pieces is life-centered design. The purpose of this podcast is to democratize design in futures and engagement, co-creation, and really explain for those who might just be entering this space what some of these terms might mean. So I was wondering if we could start with you explaining what life-centered design might be, what it looks like in practice, and how you ensure that it's deeply embedded in the work that you do, recognizing that you're working in so many different spaces and with so many different individuals and organizations.
Life-centered design is essentially an approach that broadens the traditional idea of human-centered design to recognize that people, other living beings, and the environment are part of one interconnected system. Rather than isolating human needs from the ecosystems and cultures in which they're rooted, life-centered design focuses explicitly on the well-being of all life forms in this ecosystem and the ecological context they inhabit. It's a response to the fact that many processes of business modeling, organizational design, product design, public policy, they look at corporations, governments, institutions as sometimes being independent of their environments, with many corporate interests prioritizing profits over planet and people. This winds up costing our planet and our individual and societal health tremendously. So life-centered design recognizes these interconnections in nature and how it connects to human systems of culture, health, economics, trade, and policy. It pushes back at this idea that humans have dominion over nature as opposed to being part of it.
We are mutually dependent on nature, and we've often been educated in a Western context that we are above it or separate from it, but we're mutually dependent on each other, and that should not be left out of our design, our decisions, and our belief systems.
We're in a pathway to incorporating these viewpoints and perspectives. Part of it starts from recognizing the interdependencies. So by viewing human systems as a part of natural ecosystems, we acknowledge that our design and any decisions affect and are affected by the broader web of life. For an example there, it's changes to land use, policy decisions, or supply chains. They can really send shockwaves to river systems, soil quality, as well as animal populations. We also look at co-creation with a pretty diverse array of stakeholders. We include scholars, indigenous communities, as well as those traditionally marginalized in decision-making processes. And we also prioritize a focus on climate, on science, life sciences, understanding biology in a deep way to understand what the needs there are. Part of that extends to this holistic stakeholder mapping and the idea of mapping not just human stakeholders, but what ecosystems could be impacted as well, rivers, forests, wildlife. This helps prevent the externalization of environmental or community costs solely for financial gain or profit. Like, as I mentioned, research into life sciences, biology, we're working with an amazing shark scientist as well, Justin Blake, who did work for BBC Planet Earth. His perspectives also help shape and understand needs of different life forms. And then the final piece there is this goal and intention of designing for mutual benefit. Rather than viewing the environment as a resource to be exploited, life-centered design seeks solutions where you've got the ecological, social, and economic priorities reinforcing one another as opposed to being at odds. An example there would be the design of products or services that restore habitats and support local livelihoods at the same time.
One of the things that we've been tracking on the podcast are the types of trends or emergences that are happening in the foresight and design space. I think there's been a lot more interest and focus on life-centered design in the design space and foresight space, but at the same time, working in a corporate capacity or with other organizations, it feels like this is still something that is emerging. But I wonder if you have any insights to share on how the reception is to this centering of life-centered design. Have you seen any shifts in the space as you've worked with clients? Has there been greater uptake? What does that look like as you enter into these engagements with clients who may not necessarily be as familiar with the design space?
Some people get it right away or are very interested in pursuing that direction, while with some organizations, there's been a bit of pushback, especially ones that are more rooted in manufacturing, traditional corporate hierarchies. Sometimes we find, unfortunately, that the benefits of life-centered design need to be framed in financial terms, showing how it can grow a total available market, how it can impact bottom line or market penetration. But luckily, we're seeing a tidal shift right now of people recognizing how connected we are to our climate, how connected we are to our environments, where we have a good chunk of stakeholders who will propose their own ideas around systems projects involving mapping the climate. It's changing for sure in positive directions, even though there are lots of pushback still from people who seem to insist that the environment isn't worth saving.
That's so sad.
Sad that at this stage in time, with the amount of information and knowledge we have, the ability we have to connect, that there's still so many echo chambers and bubbles and people stuck in a particular viewpoint or mindset. I guess it's also a human arrogance thing, feeling that we are above nature somehow and not going into that effort to preserve, conserve, or at least understand it.
I feel the tragedy in that dovetails into this idea of how we as individuals or organizations, we're constantly bumping up into circumstances that are less than ideal that we're trying to navigate. And that speaks to another aspect of your work that I find very interesting and compelling, and that's around resiliency. The need for individuals or organizations or communities to be resilient. I was speaking with one individual earlier around trying to create resilient communities. And this individual shared with me the research that's going into a backlash against resiliency, because resiliency then puts the onus on the individual or the community that is being subject to these unfortunate conditions to then weather the storm, which I hadn't thought of it in that way before. But I think that there's still this inescapable fact of life, especially in the world that we're living in right now, that a degree of resiliency is needed to survive in what's currently happening in various spaces. And I wonder if you have any takeaways or tools for individuals that are living in these uncertain times to build their own resilience to tragedy.
A lot of Western culture is really focused on individualism. You have to do it alone, where resiliency or sustainability is about community and how we move through things collectively and together. Shifting those paradigms or those worldviews on you have to go do this alone versus how do we do this together? How do we talk across sectors? Even in an organization, there's often all these silos. So how do we work to incorporate different perspectives in the work we do and also find ways that are not just about working so hard that you're burning out, but you're finding ways and times to regenerate some of that energy. So what does that look like in a more sustainable way of working at all levels, from personally to organizationally to societally?
And resilience connects very much to mindsets. This idea of approaching things with a positive framing, where we're talking about cultivating a beautiful garden, not building an anti-barren, anti-weed space. Language matters a lot in what we can imagine and visualize, cultivating a flexibility in mindsets that can embrace multiple perspectives, even those you might fundamentally disagree with. Remain open to revisiting or questioning long-standing beliefs. So ideally for resilience, if you can hold on to multiple truths that might even be contradictory at one time, can help you challenge dogmas, challenge a lot of cultural buildup, because you have societal norms, legal definitions, and truths evolving over time. And things that were once considered right or inevitable may longer serve populations, communities, or individuals. So being willing to push back at what is and blend that optimism with a bit of realism and approaching with the growth and abundance-based mindset as opposed to scarcity can be really helpful for building that feeling of sustainability.
One of my big takeaways is easier said than done. It's learning to be comfortable with ambiguity. I know we heard this so many times in school as well as with clients, but it really is so important because when we're faced with uncertainty, many people, myself included, always want to have a solution or some kind of answer as soon as possible to get out of that uncomfortable uncertainty. But being comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty allows you to sit in it. It allows you to explore and really understand the complexity of a situation and then respond intentionally rather than that short-term react and making decisions because we just don't want to feel that uncomfortableness anymore. It's really about being able to sit with something long enough to understand the long-term implications and make those decisions that develop that mutual benefit that is so important in community.
One of the things that particularly draws me to your team and I really admire about your group is that you can contain such complex and heartfelt concepts and apply it across scales. So the things that we talk about could potentially feel theoretical, and yet they have very true and real applications. What I've really enjoyed through these conversations that I've been having for this podcast is oftentimes I'm meeting with groups such as yourself, where it's like, okay, this is a design team, a foresight team plus more. There's more to it. There's the package, what you see at the front end, but then there's so much beneath the surface. I also love the way that your team in particular seems to oscillate between the individual and the collective. Fran, you mentioned we'll be talking about this a little bit later, but you've been able to work through some deeply personal experiences, but also at a collective level. And I think that's a very tall order. It's a hard thing to do, and yet you do it well. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that collective memory piece, because we're talking about the collective, we're talking about the community. You work a lot with collective memory and how it shapes what's possible. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that concept with listeners who may not necessarily have thought of this before or who have worked in this space before.
When you're dealing with systemic projects, you're dealing with centuries, depending on the population, of collective memory, of cultural traditions, of history, of the land, of practices, of policies. Sometimes, even though we may be talking in the present day, the shadows of the past always stays very close to our societies. And we see it in the way societies commemorate events, the way they commemorate disaster. We have plaques, statues. So collective remembrance tends to be a big deal for people. We find that that's a critical piece to incorporate in our research and inquiry, because the collective memory isn't always uniform either. It's not uniformly distributed in a population. You've got people who subscribe to it, people who don't, people who have a mix. You have a mix of different types of collective memories as well at one place, depending on political orientation, depending on background, culture, identity. I like this question because it's nuanced, this idea of collective memory. It really helps us shape our understanding of what's possible, but what people in a population are holding on to as well. When we're designing to help people think about their futures, we recognize that desire for the future is intricately tied to their visions of who they are right now and the visions of where they came from. This led us into developing a framework around grief-informed futures as well that really helps stakeholders to think about their past, presents, and futures in a way that acknowledges personal, community, and societal occurrences, in this case, grief, and how that might impact their choice architecture, agency, and potential in the future. Grief shapes our perception of our past, as mentioned, and shapes our actions in the present, as well as our ability to imagine what's possible. A history of trauma or a history of terrible economic conditions, of dealing with conflict, can limit our idea of what might be achievable or possible for us. So our approach invites stakeholders to explore the way that unprocessed or unacknowledged grief, or acknowledged grief alike, can subtly influence decision-making, governance, and design. We look at incorporating elements around probing personal values, understanding what stakeholders and societies have lost in the past due to war and conflict, due to health issues, economic issues, environmental disasters, recognizing that these losses affect their worldview, as well as the mental, emotional, and cultural structures that guide both everyday and long-term decisions, from the most mundane things to big-ticket decisions. Part of this framework looks at challenging personal and societal biases, allowing space for people to encounter their blocks, and then finally looking at elements of anticipatory grief as well, as we look into the future and understand both fears with ambiguity and uncertainty, but understanding also what must be given up in the pursuit of each direction or choice.
I think this is so important. And this framework that you've developed around grief-informed futures is so important. And I wonder how this looks in practice, because I think part of the work that you've unpacked as well is this idea of grief having this stigma and being so private, and the idea of making it more understandable or more spoken about. But when you go to these clients in a work setting or business setting, is that entry point, let's talk about grief-informed futures, or is it we're going to do stakeholder and personal reflection, and then the grief-informed futures piece is sprinkled in there? How does that look, and how is that received?
When we work with clients, we usually try and keep a lot of the technicalities under the hood. It's kind of like when you're going to a car showroom. They're talking less about the combustion engine and the nature of petroleum extraction, but more about how fast you'll get from point A to B and the comfort. Sometimes we find by directly naming a framework, it can bias clients, it can bias people in the room, it can anchor them into a way of thought. So we try to lead them slowly towards scaffolding where they don't have to think about the issues. We frame it as a personal reflection often. then we guide into, we don't shy away from the fact that grief informed futures at all. We do go directly to tackling and probing each of these issues. Most recently, we did a leadership transition with a major organization in the environmental space and understanding their grief around the situations that exist in the world, looking at what people are afraid to give up in their transitions. Once we create a safe space for clients, people are surprisingly willing to be vulnerable. That extends to our workshop design process, where a big priority is designing safe spaces, places where people can feel vulnerable, comfortable. We do a mixture of private and public sharebacks, ensuring anonymity. There are a number of practices and ways to go about it.
Speaking from a Western colonial context, grief has been removed from our culture. We don't teach about it. We don't talk about it. The only time we deal with it is when we're feeling it. And then we're expected to make big decisions when we're going through it.
Let's talk a bit more about grief. You have this wildly successful installation initiative, Space for Grief. And I was wondering if you would be able to unpack that initiative for us, how it came to be, how it has evolved since that initial inception.
Space for Grief speaks to creating literal physical space for grief, as well as metaphorical spaces for conversation and acceptance within our communities and for ourselves. In terms of how it came to be, we'd actually been working for a few years and noticed that grief kept coming up in our work. It came up in our research across systems, and we found significant gaps through our own personal, professional, and academic experiences. In terms of academic research, I wrote my master's thesis on why don't we talk about it in Western culture and how can we design more inclusive death and grief practices in our culture. I wanted to really explore that because of what was coming up in our work. And then as a team with experience in product and service design, we noticed many pain points across the ecosystem in unexpected places. There were these inflection points around grief that no one was talking about. And it was like, okay, that's happening. Okay, how do we design a solution? It's like, okay, wait, why is this happening?
We found a number of very interesting ones, some in places that you'd expect, like in the legal system around anticipation, fairness, and time. But then in unexpected areas, like in athletes around gold medal grief of an Olympic athlete and realizing what they've had to sacrifice and give up along the way, or realizing that they've hit the pinnacle of their career, what comes after. And of course, grief from retirement and injury. Then we found grief in the arts spaces around mental health struggles, around promotional cycles, social media, the balancing of the workload with administrative work, funding and promo. And then even within the entrepreneurship sector, around the sacrifices that people make to build their business, or even the grief that could come from something seemingly positive, like selling a business. Then there were personal cases as well. Growing up in Bangladesh and moving to Canada, from a collectivist culture to more individualistic, noticing that even though there are still so many stigmas in Asia and beliefs in stoicism, we noticed that grief was a lot more laid out in collectivist cultures. By the time I was a teenager, I had been to dozens of funerals in the community. Grief were a more public thing. People went over to visit for months, and even years after somebody had passed, people would bring it up and still send food and gestures, whereas it felt very private and siloed here in North America. This led us to create a systems map.
In 2023, we presented at the Relating Systems and Design Conference a systems map or gigamap on the silent struggle with grief, which really laid out a comprehensive overview on how grief permeates not just individuals, but also communities and societal structures. We went really deep. It's available online for anyone that wants to pick it up. And what became increasingly clear was that existing systems failed to support grief in meaningful and adequate ways, which is a striking shortcoming for such a universal human experience. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter your culture, your gender, anything. We're all going to experience grief. So why does grief need dedicated space? We're social creatures and we're not meant to grieve alone. We're dealing with a social isolation and loneliness epidemic in Canada and Western culture. So creating physical space for grief allows people to come and process emotion, hold one another in loss, and challenge the idea that has permeated this culture for a while, that grief should be private, fast, or linear. So many people are carrying grief with nowhere to express it. And so creating a space where people can go and be seen and heard in their grief There's a release that happens when you get to express it or just be seen and not feel alone. In the past, community and religion often held the space where people would go to grieve, but today many people don't belong to those structures, or religion is a very exclusive experience. So you are part of it, that's great, but there's a growing number of people that aren't connected in that way. As cities become more diverse, like Toronto, where nearly half the population was born outside of Canada, we're navigating a wide range of cultural grief traditions or people that don't have grief traditions, but we don't have any shared knowledge or rituals. So creating a space that invites everyone to it, that is inclusive, accessible, that's a way to bridge that gap. We're not trying to start anything from scratch, but it's a way where people can come together and share and really identify what they need and bring it to the forefront.
It's recognizing that there aren't too many other spaces that are created in places where people tend to spend the most of their times. Our workplaces, our academic institutions, we noticed aren't the greatest at dealing with grief. And this is really evident in our bereavement policies in North America, where people can get less than a week, sometimes even 2 days, regardless of whether you've lost a parent, a child, a pet, no matter what it is. Each loss carries a burden to the other people dealing with it. This is a response to our institutions not creating those spaces in many ways.
That grief-informed futures framework that you had developed, did that framework come from this space for grief installation, or did it predate that? I don't know if this is a chicken and the egg sort of question, but I'm curious about how that looked like in your work as it unfolded.
As we were doing our research, we weren't able to find too much specifically on grief-informed futures. We found work on trauma-informed futures, which tends to go probing on deep trauma. We noticed there was a gap around grief that could be dealt with without the risk of further triggering people within grief-informed futures. We're still searching for a lot of frameworks, and there's a lot of good work that exists around grief in societies, helping people navigate change. But when it comes to future frameworks, this is something that we're in a little bit of uncharted territory, and we're exploring and developing, recognizing that we stand on the shoulder of giants, that there's so many people, their work in the fields of psychology and behavioral economics, in foresight, design, and systems have given us that scaffolding to be able to explore some of these areas.
Often, if we think of it pragmatically in change management, there's this idea that, okay, we're going to change this happening, move on. Without creating the space, people need to process change. And so that's where we're seeing it really stand out for people. We're certain that change is going to happen, but the space to process that change is something we're really trying to hold for people and allow for that things are not always going to be the way they were. They will change, but how do we acknowledge that change is happening and create the space and honor what's needed in order to process that change in the best way possible so that we can move forward?
This idea that grief is universal is helpful because it shows up in almost every culture and identity. When it comes to designing frameworks, we find that it requires looking at it from a multitude of disciplines, a multitude of cultural leanings and lenses.
One of the big things that we did see is that even though we brought grief-informed futures into our client work, into those sessions, at the end, a report would come out, and a lot of times what was felt and said in those spaces didn't necessarily always translate out into the decisions further down the line. Yes, we've created this safe space, but how do we make sure that turns into change? How do we make sure that people feel it, not just intellectually, but also through their hearts, through the decisions that they're making? That's really where we saw that there was an opportunity for creating a physical space where there was connection, where there was immersion, there was an engagement of all the senses to really embody what those things meant. Not just simply feel it in these safe spaces with people you feel safe with, but also publicly where you are witnessing as well as being a part of somebody else's journey.
That's beautiful and so important. So far, Space for Grief has been installation-based. Is there any talk or interest in creating a permanent space for grief?
Yeah, definitely. The dream is to create permanent public space for grief. I see examples of different things throughout the world, whether it's ashrams or different spaces that exist. And it's really beautiful. I just want to put this out there. Whenever we've created the space, we get so many volunteers, and this is a volunteer-led, artist-led project. It's a community project. Every time we do it, we get so many volunteers, so many people that have been with us since the beginning, so many people that want to hold space for others. There's something very powerful there. It feels like people are waiting for it to happen. It's just a matter of figuring out, what does that look like if we can get there? How could it help things? How would it help us slow down and pause and maybe pay attention to some of the social issues that so many people, especially those on the front line, are dealing with every day and not being recognized for that work?
I feel like your team has successfully been able to have art and business and hold those two things in a way that's not mutually exclusive. And I wonder if this is something that you're doing mindfully, if this is something that has emerged organically. I wonder if you ever feel that push and pull between, here's our design consulting, this is the work we're doing with businesses, versus this is the space we're creating.
Part of that intersection of art and business comes very organically. I think each of us has a different orientation with it. And from a personal standpoint, I can speak to the experience dating back to when I was a teenager in Bangladesh. I used to enjoy playing a lot of English heavy metal music, and trying to find venues for that at the time in the 90s was trickier. So my friends and I, some of the local bands, we'd start organizing our own shows to start to play. And that aspect of organizing, of putting things together, the only place that would host us at the time was a fried chicken place called London Fried Chicken in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And we were playing a rock concert in a fried chicken place. But fast forward a couple of years from then, when we were working with the US Embassy, with Pepsi Cola, and organizing large-scale open-air shows and festivals, it was still us and our friends coming together, playing shows and having fun. But implicitly in the background, we were developing the skills around building and managing teams, around promotion, around successful event design. And that thread carried itself through life. I've always enjoyed organizing events, organizing performances, shows, and finding new ways to create art.
I think it's very interesting that art and business have always been seen as separate silos, and one does not inform the other. But I think what we've really seen in systems change is that you need everybody to be a part of this. The artists are who help you imagine the futures that we have, that bring that creativity to life, that immerse people in that to really viscerally feel what it is that we are looking for. And that's always been missing from business. Business is always about, let me decide for you, whereas art was really about for us, by us. So it's really finding that middle of, how do you change what it looks like to make those decisions for business by using art-based approaches, by bringing what was so beautiful about art into a place where there's co-creation.
Art is inherently in almost everything, right? Art is expression. There's art in business, in the design of business. I think there's more connection to arts and business in the world than many folks realize as well. So many artists and freelancers are out there handling so many administrative back-end functions, applying, trying and finding funding. I feel like a lot of artists out there are incorporating business into their work.
Looking at one piece of art can tell you a story. There's something very embodied that happens that when you read a report, it doesn't happen in the same way. And so that's where we see the magic, especially with Space for Grief. We are working towards systems change with Space for Grief, as Zian alluded to earlier, around bereavement policies. We recently were featured in the Philanthropist Journal, which is an amazing Canadian-based journal. And we were like, what does bereavement policy look like across Canada? And most of it is 1 to 3 days paid, but mostly unpaid, and then up to 7 days unpaid. On top of that, you can take stress leave, which is a whole other thing. But the first week is just organizing and paperwork.
I agree. The first week is absolutely just administration. It's survival. It's such an important conversation to have. I wanted to take the time to open the space to see what's on the horizon. If there's anything that you want to share with listeners, any call outs, upcoming events or challenges that you would like to share with the crowd.
It's deeply moving to see Space for Grief resonate across cultures, ages, and identities. Moving to the future, we're looking at exploring how grief intersects with other emotional and social landscapes such as climate anxiety, displacement, and intergenerational memory. We're exploring the fidelity of our materials, audio, and visual elements to enhance the storytelling and comprehension alike. So we're exploring visual techniques, color palettes, and imagery. We're exploring new musical motifs, textures, chord progressions, and keys, as well as unique combinations of instruments and organic sounds. Experimenting with materials, things that tell the stories of land and people, things that evoke feelings of comfort and safety, things that are complementary to the narrative, but also durable. And playing around with these ideas and looking at our past experiences and what resonated. And a big focus for us there is accessibility and barriers to participation, as well as new narrative paradigms and formats from across cultures, because so many cultures have unique forms of narrative that go beyond our typical hero's journey and really unique and interesting storytelling formats. We're grateful that we also have a few things coming up for us.
Given that we work across sectors and our clients right now span everything from arts and culture, healthcare, food, climate change, AI, housing and government, because we have this high-level view of what's happening in the world around us, as well as that really in-depth view on the ground of how things get done, we're really excited to see some of the clients that we're working with start to make that shift into thinking more broadly, more long-term, and really more relationally as well. So we really see that there's such an opportunity now to not just see one person charge ahead, but to actually bring everybody along with them. That creates so much hope in seeing that maybe there is really something here. There's a groundswell that's happening. There's a shift in culture, in narrative that's happening that can be very exciting, where a lot more people have agency, a lot more people can play and be a part of that decision making as well.
We're seeing a growing number of clients that want to learn about or embed grief-informed futures as well as systems thinking expertise into their work. So we're very excited and empowered by that. So we're going to keep trucking on and continue to focus on building highly accessible public engagement and placemaking projects. And if we can inspire one person along the path, we're happy.
Thank you all for the time today, and I can reassure you that you have inspired far more than just one person. You've inspired many people already, and I can't wait to see where the movement goes. Thank you so much, and we'll be sharing information with listeners. We'll be keeping an eye on your socials and your postings and making sure that if there's anything with relation to Method Collective or Space for Grief, we would be able to promote it further.
Thank you again, Mia, for having us. I really appreciate the time and energy.
Thank you so much, Mia.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Method Collective. From their systems approach to life-centered design, to their pioneering work with grief-informed futures, the team shows us how reimagining resilience and honoring collective memory can transform not only individuals, but entire communities. Projects like Space for Grief remind us that grief isn't something to hide or rush through. It's part of how we heal, connect, and build better futures together. If you found this episode insightful, please consider sharing it with your networks or leaving us a review. The more we can open up these conversations, the closer we get to creating futures that will space for everyone. Tag us on Instagram or LinkedIn, share your thoughts, and let's keep the discussion going about how we can shape better futures together. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Futures Hub so you never miss an episode. We have more incredible guests coming your way, diving deep into the intersections of foresight, community, and co-creation. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep imagining, keep co-creating, and keep working towards those better futures for all.